Thank you, Tony. I'm going to introduce Jeremy Scott. Jeremy has done something that most of us could never probably even ponder. He's ridden his bicycle over here from London to his hometown of Auckland with no support, no sponsorship. He covered 52,000 kilometres in just over 2.5 years. Now that works out, if we keep the maths simple, at about 400 kilometres a week, roughly 60 kilometres a day, day in, day out, for 2.5 years. Now if you think about that, if you miss a day, have a rest day, that means you've got to do 120 kilometres the next day to catch up. So it's quite an effort. I did something today that I'd been pondering for quite a while, and that was I rode my bike the 5 kilometres to Rotary. And I'm not looking forward to the ride home. On that note, I'll hand over to Jeremy. Jeremy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Over the next 20 minutes, I'd like to offer you all just a tiny glimpse into the 2.5 years I spent cycling from one side of the planet to the other. But I think it's just as important not to speak about the bike ride itself, but mention the mistakes I made, because there were certainly a lot of those, the lessons I learnt, and how this particular journey changed me as a human being. And the fact that I even had the opportunity to attempt this bike ride was a bit of a miracle in itself, where I would have been no more than a few days old, and my mum realised that something was seriously wrong. So she sought the advice of some medical professionals who actually misdiagnosed my condition as being some kind of chest infection. But my mum's gut instinct told her it was something far more serious than this. So she persisted until eventually they discovered I had a huge hole between the 2 chambers in the heart, which in turn was causing a lot of problems for the aorta valve. My cardiologist was a man called Sir Brian Barrett-Boys, who happened to be one of the greatest cardiologists of his generation. As good as Sir Brian was, he didn't want to operate while I was a little wee toddler, because he didn't think I'd be strong enough to survive. So we waited for a couple of years, and over those first few years of my life, my condition started to deteriorate at such a rate that Sir Brian had no choice, and he had to operate. And all he could say to my parents, he said, look, you have to understand and appreciate there are always risks involved in a procedure like this. There are never guarantees. So in the lead up to that surgery, my poor parents didn't want to take any photos of me because they thought they might be the last photos they ever took. Well, I'm here. Surgery didn't go too bad, and it really changed me in so many ways. I went from being a toddler who I couldn't even run around a field because I couldn't get blood to my arms and my legs, through to being a 6-year-old who was playing soccer, cricket, tennis, and I was doing everything all the other kids could do. And I think those frustrating years of my life installed a little bit of grit into my character. So moving forward in life, I went to live in the United Kingdom, and while I was there, I was healthy, happy, but I didn't feel challenged. And over the years, I came up with hundreds of ideas of how I could challenge myself, but to be honest, I lacked the courage to do anything about it. I dreamt pretty big, but I was just as good at fabricating lame excuses and convincing myself why I couldn't turn my ideas into reality. But one day, November 2004, everything changed. I returned home from work to find a magazine called the TNT on the coffee table. Inside this particular magazine were a series of different articles about a number of different people who had completed little cycling journeys in different parts of the world. And as I sat there in my flat in London, I couldn't decide which one of them I liked the most. And then I started to think, well, I've got to get home eventually, so why can't I do it on a bike? And my flatmates thought this was a little strange because I didn't even have a bike at this point in my life. but I knew I'd make it happen. I would get the bike. And I didn't set off on this journey for another 7 years. It was 7 years in the planning. And when I started the journey, I wish I could tell you that I was feeling full of confidence and self-belief, but I was absolutely petrified. But I had to take that first step and just give it a go. And over those first few weeks, I stuffed up day after day, whether it be not carrying enough food, not carrying enough water, or the complete opposite, and carrying far too much stuff, which I didn't really need, or getting flustered when I went the wrong way. But I needed to go through those first few weeks, and that was where I learned so much more than I had in the previous 7 years reading through books and looking over websites. Something I needed to do very early in this journey was stop thinking about riding from London to New Zealand, because when I did that, I wasn't a happy boy because the journey was just too overwhelming. So I had to start breaking it down into these much smaller sections. And I told myself, Jeremy, just get yourself to Amsterdam. And once I'd made it there, I'd focus on Prague. Then it was Vienna, and then it was Budapest. And by breaking it into these much smaller sections, I then realised I was making progress, and I could take a step back and start looking at the big picture again. It took me about 10 weeks to cycle across to, Europe, and I arrived up at the Yeni Mosque in Istanbul. And as I got there, I could smell the grilled fish, you could hear the evening call to prayer, and it was this incredible feeling to think to myself, I don't know how you've done it, but you've just made it across Europe. And if you can get across that, you can get across Turkey. And if you can get across Turkey, you're going to make it across Iran. So that was the first moment that I genuinely believed I would make it all the way from London to New Zealand. It was a good thing that my confidence had grown by that point of time, because Turkey turned out to be the toughest country of my entire journey. As I made my way up past Cappadocia, this particular day, I had to wait until about 10:30 in the morning for it to warm up to 20 degrees below freezing. Yeah, glad some of you find it funny, but overnight temperatures were dropping to 40 degrees below freezing. And where in Europe I was looking at that next city, this place I was looking no further than the top of that first hill. Someone finds that funny as well. I had minor frostbite on my face, on my fingers, and on the end of my toes. And I won't lie, I absolutely hated so many of those days up in those hills. But having got through it, I then had this marker against which I could measure every other challenge that came my way. And having been through those mountains of eastern Turkey, I pretty much had the confidence to take on whatever else came in my direction. Iran was a country which I had looked forward to more than any other on this journey, because I'd heard so many beautiful things about the people there. And as amazing as they were, unfortunately, I also had what turned out to be my most terrifying encounter of the journey. I stopped off at a little wee truck stop restaurant to collect some water before camping for the night. And these guys invited me in, which was perfectly normal in Iran. And it wasn't long before I realised that this little restaurant of theirs was a bit of a cover for their drug dealing business. And they were peddling large quantities of drugs. So when I saw this, I thought, I need to get out of here pretty smart. But before I could do so, the owner came back in from the kitchen with 2 guns, sat me down at a little wee table. He pushed one of the guns to me and pulled the other one to himself. And as he looked me in the eye with this horrible grin, he says, "Show us how you hold that gun." What I realised very quickly there was he was more than happy for me to play with the gun he had given me. The one that he had, he was keeping very close to himself and keeping his arms over the top of it. You tell me which one had bullets and which one didn't. So I thought, I've got to keep calm, because if I panicked and took off, they would probably think I was going to the police. And with it being the death penalty in Iran for dealing drugs, I was in the middle of nowhere, they had guns, and it wouldn't have been hard to stop me. So I had to stay there. And when these gentlemen were not looking, I grabbed my passport, put that in one pocket, I put a very sharp knife in the other, and I felt I had no choice. I was quite calmly, quite methodically working through how many of these guys I might need to kill if I had any chance of seeing daylight. And I was very prepared to do this. Thankfully, it didn't come to that, because 2 trucks arrived and there were 2 men in each truck. And unlike most people who went there to buy drugs, these guys ordered food. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, this might be my last chance and I've just got to go for it. So I grabbed my bike and I started wheeling it out the door. And one of these men grabbed the bike and he's like, no, 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 you stay. And I'm like, no, 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 I'm going. So I just kept on pushing and they had to let go. And I rode for about 40 kilometres in the middle of the night, turned up at this little wee ambulance station about 1:30 in the morning, where these 2 guys took me in, gave me some tea, shelter, and they made sure that I was perfectly comfortable before they went back to bed. And I was devastated that this incident happened in Iran, because in absolutely no way at all does that reflect the overwhelming kindness and warmth I received all the way through the country. This guy was a far more typical example. What you see there are his possessions in life. He has a few sacks that he carries around on the back of a donkey. He sleeps out under the stars and he minds his goats. That is his life. Yet when this man saw me, he called me over, pulled out some potatoes, tomatoes, a few spices, and began to prepare a little meal, which he cooked in the little wee blackened pot you can see at the front of the photo there. So I thought I'd contribute some food to this meal that he was cooking, but he wouldn't let me do it. And I then discovered he only cooked up 1 portion of food. He gave that portion of food to me. And it's just so incredibly humbling that you sit there and you think, here is a man who, in our Western eyes, basically has nothing. Yet he gave a complete stranger everything he's got. And it was that type of encounter I had day after day, all the way through Iran. As I rode away from that man, I literally broke down in tears. I was so embarrassed about who I am. Because when you receive that type of kindness and warmth from complete strangers, you start to ask yourself, how would he be treated if he came to Adelaide, or to Auckland, or to any other Western city for that matter? And there is no way he would receive the same kindness that he gave me when I was in his country. And that was one of the biggest lessons I learned cycling through a lot of the Islamic countries. From there, I made my way into Central Asia, which consisted of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and then Kyrgyzstan. And I met this French couple up in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan. Eric had been on the road for about 5 months at this point of time. He had cycled all the way from Paris, but his girlfriend at the back of the photo there, she couldn't afford to start the journey with him. So she stayed in France, saved her euros, and less than 3 or 4 days before she flew into Central Asia, she purchased her bike. So she also had done very little training. And when she got there, she had some people help put on the wheels, put on the pedals, put on the seats and the handlebars. And less than 1 week later, she was going over a 3,800 metre high mountain pass. I think she is the perfect example of what anyone can achieve if you stop making excuses and you can find the courage to take that first step. Because she had no training, but she went to cycle on through China, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and then the Americas. Yeah, something to think about. Moving forward, I made my way into the west of China, where there's a desert called the Taklamakan, which is roughly 1.5 times the size of Britain, and it's notorious for the heat, where the temperatures often got well above 50 degrees, but also these massive sandstorms. I would have been no more than 1 or 2 days into the desert when on the horizon I just saw this wall of sand just rolling towards me. And your natural instinct is to just run and hide. There's not many places to hide out there, unfortunately. There was absolutely nothing. And the closer it got, I started to think, I don't know whether I'm being brave or just remarkably stupid, but I've just got to ride into this and see how it goes. It may have been an hour later, it might have been 5 hours later, but eventually I popped out the other side, and every time I did, my confidence grew that little bit more, because I knew if I can get through it once, the next time I'll be able to do it again, only the next time I will be a little bit more clever about the way I approach it. And it was the same as the mountains of Turkey, where I had spent years reading about these places, these conditions, but that's in the safety of your own home when you're sitting in front of the heater drinking a cup of tea. It's not until you're out there for the first day, facing that first wall of sand that's coming towards you, that was where I learned the lessons I needed to get through each and every day. It was on the journey. So I went right the way across China, South Korea, and then Japan. And around about the middle of winter, I came back into China. And this was a place called Zhangjiajie. So if you can imagine the valley shrouded in mist, that's where they got the idea for the movie Avatar. That's it. And this is a little village called Fenghuang, which I'd never even heard of the place before I set off from London. But I really began to appreciate the value of local knowledge. And by starting to slow down, take the time to speak with the people around me, that's where I got the value from my journey. It wasn't a race, it was about the experience. It was about just enjoying every day for what it was worth. And places like this, you feel like you've just stepped back in time 1,000 years. So why would you want to race past a place like this? It wasn't a hurry. As I rolled into Hanoi, I was introduced to a man called Warren Boas. And this turned out to be one of the most life-changing encounters I expect to ever have. Warren and I got chatting, and he asked me if I was raising any money for any charities. And I said, yes, I was doing my bit for the Australian, the New Zealand, and also the British Art Foundations. After explaining my reasons why I chose these charities, completely out of the blue, Warren asked me, was your surgeon Sir Brian Barrett-Boys by any chance? And I just looked at him. I said, how do you know Sir Brian? And he said, well, my brother was operated on by the same guy. And my eyes just lit up. I was like, what? I said, well, how's your brother doing? Where does he live now? I said, I don't care where he lives. I'm changing direction on this bike. I need to go and meet your brother. It was just something I felt I had to do. But I could see Warren's head drop, and he said, you can't meet my brother because he died during the operation. Paul's operation was just 2 years before mine, and we quickly realised that Sir Brian had obviously learned a lot of lessons from Paul's failed operation, which he carried forward to my successful procedure just 2 years later. As Warren and I sat there, we realised what had happened. I can't tell you how difficult it was to look him in the eye and say, look, I am so sorry, but I think your brother's death has gone a long way to saving my life. And that incident changed so much about the way I think. So right the way through Southeast Asia I went and popped into Northern Australia, where I was met by my Uncle David and his wife Karen, both Rotarians, and they've actually just recently received the 2015 Rotary Health Medal for the work they've done for Rotary Health. And they cycled with me from Darwin to Cairns, which was a distance of about 3,100 kilometres, and they banged it out in just on a month. And I'd get to the end of the day, and my legs were broken, I'm tired, ready to sleep, and my 70-year-old uncle would ask me, Jeremy, how are you feeling? Would you tell him the truth? I had no way was I going to tell him how I was feeling. But it was just beautiful to sit back and look at these two and think to myself, if I can keep myself healthy and active in my later years in life, fingers crossed I can be doing half as much as what they're achieving with theirs. So I went right down the Great Divide to Melbourne, then I popped across to Christchurch. And as I did so, I had so many different emotions going on. On one hand, I knew I was one of the most beautiful locations on earth, call me one-eyed, for riding a bicycle. But on the other, there were no more borders to cross. And this is the end of the line. When I started this journey, I was so scared of the unknown and the enormity of what I was attempting, but it wasn't long before I was enjoying this simple existence, where all I needed was some food, water, and some place to put my tent at night. And I've genuinely never been more happy than when I've had so few possessions around me. As I rolled up to the finish line, I thought it was going to be easy. I thought I'd hop off the bike and I'd go and celebrate with family and friends. But as I saw the faces of so many people who had given me this incredible amount of support over the previous 2.5 years, my heart just started to race. And then a little bit further, the bike came to a halt, I hopped off, and as I put up the stand and let go of those handlebars for the last time, I was just completely overwhelmed with emotion. As I thought back to how scared, insecure, and alone I felt on those first few days, probably the first few weeks to be honest, to be standing there on the other side of the world knowing that I'd successfully cycled more than enough kilometres to circumnavigate the Earth. After 2.5 years, I could finally say to myself, well done, boy, it's job done. And that is a feeling I will never forget. Having finished the journey, a really good mate of mine asked me, he said, was there any stage of this bike ride where you genuinely felt like giving up? The closest I ever come to throwing in the towel on this journey, where I was telling myself I can't do it, I just cannot do it, was way back in London on that very first day, where I just did not want to get out of bed. I was that scared. But looking back, I was quite pleased that I spent years arrogantly telling all my mates what I was going to do, because when the day came, I felt I had no choice but to get on the bike. And I think having put myself in that position, I'm now starting to appreciate what anyone can achieve if you're willing to take that first step. Having finished the journey, I needed another challenge, and I needed it pretty quick. And for me, it came in the shape of my book, The Long Road from a Broken Heart. I think the natural assumption when people see the title of the book is to think, oh, the poor boy's been dumped and he's running away. It's like, oh, bless. But it was inspired by my little 5-year-old nephew who was too young to explain to his classmates that his uncle had undergone life-saving open heart surgery, was now riding around the world to raise money for these different charities. So he just told all his schoolmates that I was riding around the world because I had a broken heart. And I thought, oh. And I think, what I've given you today doesn't scratch the surface of what I've experienced over 2.5 years. I've written the book myself, pretty much all the photos you've seen with myself, and I've paid to have it published myself. Each book I sell for $75, but I give 10% of that straight back to the Australian Heart Foundation. Because I know that if my cardiologist had not received the grants and the funding he required to continue and to further his research, you would have another speaker today. It's as simple as that. And as I said, I have barely scratched the surface, so I'll be hanging around at the end of formalities, and if anyone's got any questions, I'll be delighted to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeremy. I don't think I've ever heard the Rotary crowd so quiet. It was wonderful. And as Jeremy said, he'll be staying around, so if you have any questions, please ask them then. Due to our pretty tight schedule today, we'll dispense with the questions now. But Jeremy, thank you very much for a fantastic talk, and just in token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.